Hey, it's Glenn with the almost world famous Cactus Atlas, about to explore history in Prescott, Arizona. Whiskey Row, something that I've barely scratched the surface with before here in Prescott, and so many cool hotels and saloons and bars, and definitely something we want to come back and explore in the future. But today we're here to seek something a little bit different. History, but history of the Old West at a museum right around the corner. And let me take you over and show you what I'm talking about. If you followed our channel for any time, you now know that we're really big fans of Old West history and the history of the turn of the century America. So enter the Charlotte Hall Museum, which is supposed to house a collection of relics from one of our favorite times of American history.
Charlotte Hall lived a full life, defying gender barriers and advocating for the preservation of Arizona's rich history. Born in Kansas in November of 1870, Charlotte was no stranger to frontier life. At the age of 12, Charlotte and her family packed up and headed west to Arizona Territory along the Santa Fe Trail. Upon landing around the Prescott area, her family set up home at a place they named Orchard Ranch, where Charlotte set to work as a ranch woman, tending to animals and the orchard while attending school. It is during these years that Charlotte would demonstrate a gift for poetry and interest in Native American and pioneer history of Arizona. Charlotte saw the need to preserve these stories, artifacts, and relics, as they were getting lost to time and looting, so she began her collection with plans of eventually opening a museum to display them. This collection eventually grew to become the Charlotte Hall Museum. In addition to preserving history in the state of Arizona, Charlotte was also the first woman to hold office in the state. She served as territorial historian from 1909 to 1912. It is said she also had a hand in defeating a bill that would have brought Arizona and New Mexico territories into the Union as one state. In 1925, Charlotte served as state elector and delivered Arizona's 3 electoral votes to Calvin Coolidge to Washington, D.C., dressed in a custom copper overdress. Until her death in 1943, Charlotte continued to lecture about Arizona's history and resources, write many volumes of poetry, and expand her museum. A historical society continues her efforts today.
We've paid our admission and we're now inside the beautifully curated grounds of the Charlotte Hall Museum. I've wanted to see this place for a while now. Love all these Victorian buildings. Most, I think, are originals, maybe relocated here, but everything is pristine and beautiful in here. So, but we have a lot to see in a short amount of time, and let me explain our plan. So when you first go in and pay admission, they give you a map of the property, and you can see all of these buildings are numbered. Like here's building 1, which is this building here. But there's actually a prescribed order they recommend you do everything. So you can see they highlighted the first destination, building 1, the exhibits, and then, follow them in order. So I think that's exactly what I'm going to do today. Makes my job as a tour guide a lot easier. I honestly didn't know much about Charlotte Hall until earlier today before we came in. I really read up on her, and quite an amazing individual. Such a life, like to live a life like she did, and what she did here to help preserve history, like through philanthropic efforts. I mean, I have a whole new respect for a person I didn't really know much about earlier today. There's so many cool things on display here, like chess pieces from the 1840s and like chess pieces from the 1860s carved by prisoners at Liberty Prison. I'm not sure where that is, but oh wow, and all these Victorian era baby carriages. I always like seeing this stuff. I think it's kind of spooky, but it's so cool. This is a baby carriage, that large one there, used by the Schwinn family in the 1850s. I would assume the Schwinns had some money. Look at how beautiful that piece is. How well preserved all this stuff is too. I want to say, like, this to me this looks like something from my childhood. I'm getting really old because I had Lincoln Logs. I remember building stuff like this. but these are versions from the 1950s. And Tinker Toys, do kids today still play with these things? I mean, when I was a kid, I spent hours upon hours messing with this stuff. And Legos. You see, kids? That's the Legos of my childhood. We didn't have like themes like Star Wars and all that kind of stuff in Harry Potter. We just had plain old blocks, and I loved it. So even I remember Raggedy Ann and Andy. I think we used to have cartoons, didn't we? In the 70s, but I even probably had one of these when I was a kid. But then came Cabbage Patch Kids. And now we're putting on display Hot Wheels cars from the 1980s. Do you know how many I had of these in a shoebox? It's kind of funny if they're putting one from 1982 on display because I had so many from that exact time frame. Something that gives you an idea about the museum is that they collect and display relics from a time past, and that's exactly why we came here today. So far, I think my favorites are the carriages here, though. One thing about Charlotte Hall is she also helped preserve like natural history as well as like early Native American history. So it wasn't all just about the Anglo history of the Southwest, and there's lots of really cool things on display that I'm just now coming across here. This museum is awesome. Already I can tell you, one of the best museums I think I've ever visited in Arizona. I mean, you're gonna see old toys, and then you're gonna tell me we're gonna go see like mastodon remains and scenes from a 1994 excavation. Check that out. Wow, they got some really cool stuff. I mean, you got like relics here that are like over 13,000 years old. And it just goes on and on. You got like really old bison skulls, like dire wolf, the American lion. So is that like a saber-tooth type lion, or we actually had lions out here like that? I didn't know that. Like an old bear, like skull, short-faced bear. And then more common critters. Okay, so I've done some reading, and what this exhibit is like a rendition of the Clovis culture from over 13,000 years ago. So this is so cool because this is basically showing what life 13,000 years ago in Arizona would have been like. This museum is rad. It just has like a feeling of like one of those natural history museums, and then like Old West stuff. Reminds me of museums of my childhood growing up in St. Louis, which I thought had some of the best museums. It's bringing back that excitement that I felt as a kid going through a museum. It's been a long time since I've felt that. So on our channel, we focused heavily on these types of cultures like the Hohokam. And we've shown many of their old structures. We're talking like from 750 years ago to like about here. This is oftentimes the period of time that we focus on this channel. I'm really someone that used to be very bored by pottery. I didn't really get it. But after traveling around, and you've probably seen episodes where we found fragments of these things, it's really cool to think, especially how old some of these specimens are. The ones that I'm most familiar with are the Hohokam and the Sinawa. And I don't see anything about the Salado pottery because I think they had unique pottery, but in theory, I think you're supposed to see differences between the styles. And if we look at Hohokam pottery versus Sinawa, you can clearly see a difference. These are a lot more like red and brown and darker colors, and even the patterns are different. And another thing of great interest to me is like you see like some of the designs, like the spiral there. We've seen many petroglyphs like that, and I think I've heard that that symbol, I could have this wrong, but it might be thought to represent water or something. So I'm wondering, like, was that vessel meant to carry liquids? Does that indicate like a spring when you see it painted on a rock? I don't know, but it's really interesting to see repetition of patterns at the very least on some of their pottery that you'll see on rocks. Spectacular so far. Absolutely floored. The next stop on our tour is the Governor's Mansion. This old like log structure, historic, I believe from the 1860s is going to be my guess, but we're going to learn more as we go in. So yeah, as mentioned, this mansion is sitting on the original spot, so you're seeing it as in a really like authentic condition. And it definitely smells old. It has that really nice old smell that you guys know I love. This governor's house is awesome to explore, like the gentleman was telling us out there. I'm trying to just get to a place where I'm not disturbing other people, but like a lot of the stuff in here is original. Like it's the original cabin from like 1864, I think is what he said. And just all this stuff on display. I mean, this is so over the top cool. Like this exceeds any other similar museum that I visited. I'm gonna probably be saying that a lot today. Just getting a sense of what, probably this is the luxurious life of that time for sure. And one interesting note I read is, why is this called a mansion? Because I wouldn't really think of this as a mansion. So a sign explains when you're comparing it to like wagons and how most people out here in that time probably lived and got here, this would have been a mansion in that context, but certainly not a mansion in the more conventional way we think of it today. But this is awesome. If I were out here during that time, this is where I'd want to be. It's rare that a museum makes me hungry, but how could this not make you hungry? Look at that. Maybe not the apples that have like holes in them. All right, so next on our stop here is the Charlotte Hall building, which was constructed in 1934, back in the Depression era, supervised by the founder of the museum herself, Charlotte Hall. Oh wow, this is what I've really come here today for. Look at this space age contraption. I assume that's a antique vacuum. One of my favorite subjects, early mining history. You can see an old pick head, a gold pan, original relics from the 1800s right here. So I would say out of all the things here, I mean, everything's really pertained to really the pioneering times, other than that first exhibit where we saw, you know, history going back to 13,000 years in Arizona. But this is really what my expectations were when I wanted to come here, was to learn about this particular time period. And this museum does not disappoint. It's got a lot of stuff on display here. Wow, this is so cool too. Like an old safe. That's another thing I see a lot of that's on display, and I'm assuming you get a lot of these because, I mean, they're so durable that they're gonna withstand the test of time, unlike a lot of the wooden relics of that time. Okay, I've never heard of this, but this is one of the most frightening things I think I've ever seen. The Horribles were a fun-loving group of men that liked to dress up in weird costumes and celebrate occasions like the 4th of July. But seriously, how is that not absolutely horrifying? The Horribles became a children's presentation. Would you want your kids to see this freaky, glass-faced horror? You know, this gives me an idea. What if I like make a new TV show? You know, we haven't had a Mr. Rogers in a long time, but what if I do it with late 1800s flair? And we call it The Horribles in honor of the real Horribles. It sounds like a children's show. I mean, that's not too like far-fetched. I mean, you have the Teletubbies, I mean, come on. Maybe we can gather the best of YouTube vloggers. I'm thinking like the Justin Scard and Adam LeWoos of the world, and do this. The Horribles. It'll be a side project. It'll be awesome. Like a kid's entertainment thing. Come on. So the way Amy and I attack these things when we're working together is sometimes she'll go one way, I'll go the other. She came out of this section. This is about the Native Americans of this area, and I think some of their struggles. And she said there's some pretty hard things to read in here. So yeah, this seems like it's going to be a more somber part of the museum. So I'm really starting to see what Amy was referring to. I mean, a lot of these exhibits talk about the hard times the Indians endured back then, not only from the physical environment they had to endure, but also from the Anglos that started to come in from the east. And you can see this, what I find really just a disgusting thing, how humans could do this to other humans. But I mean, women and children crowded into a cave, cowering for their lives, while I would say gutless, spineless soldiers just shot into the cave and massacred them all. I mean, come on. You know? I mean, there's nothing noble about that at all. I mean, I wonder if humanity back then was a little bit more sensible and civilized, like what would have happened to America. I mean, this place was just rich with resources waiting to be plucked. Would things have always gone this route? Do cultures that are superior technologically always dominate the other cultures that don't? And if they want to resist, not go for the ride, is that a common thing? Will the aliens one day come and make us their pets? There's a song about that, wasn't there? I didn't see these on the map, but there's like a mercantile store here, and you can see a lot of cool wares and goods from the time frame in there. These are the kinds of things that Amy loves to take photos of, so she's probably gonna go a little hog wild here in a second. And here we are at the blacksmith shop. So for those of you that like to complain about your job today as much as I do, got some food for thought. If you could rewind back to 1880 and you were a blacksmith, you would make $15.54 a week for a 60-hour work week. And that coal forge, 1600 degrees Celsius. It's always really neat to come see this and, you know, see what it would have been like for kids. I mean, they didn't even have desks. They would just kind of sit on these benches, and the teacher was elevated up there in her pedestal. Students, eyes up here.
This was easier to write on.
Little Scotty, get your finger out of your nose. Little Martha, pay attention.
School was held from
School is in session.
During the winter.
You always hear those stories about back in my day. This is the ultimate back in my day place. They're talking about how children were responsible for bringing their own firewood in there. And then, like, think about today, folks, and all the little minor things we complain about in our society. I mean, come on. This is old school right there. Old school discipline, the old school way of doing things. Gotta respect that. This is the stuff I love. This is the Old West, the real deal right here. Let's go see what they got in there. Let's go see why you're so miserable. Be sure to duck. But now we can stand up straight, thank goodness. So clearly there's been a lot of restoration on this thing. That lumber looks pretty new and fresh, but this is still really cool nonetheless. I'm gonna guess this is probably ponderosa pine, and I'm gonna guess this is all the original wood. It certainly looks like it is. Probably the same fireplace. Fireplaces are usually the last thing that seem to stand after a cabin. All the wood will deteriorate, and all you have left is the fireplace. So I'm gonna guess that's probably original. And we can kind of get a sense of what it would have been like to live in this. So even though this is the first cabin in Arizona, it served many purposes throughout its time. According to a sign over here, it was the first law office in Arizona, the first general store in central Arizona. It was also a church, like a house of worship. It was a boarding house, and then actually the first courthouse in the state of Arizona. Isn't that cool though? That think of all the different uses of this over time. These grounds are absolutely beautiful. Just the landscaping and how clean and well maintained this all is. That's just nice alone. I'd wander around here just for that. The next stop on the tour is this ranch house, which was built in 1936 by Charlotte Hall as a tribute to early ranchers. My assumption is this is representative of the lifestyle of early pioneers that came out to settle this area. So let's go inside and check it out.
Multi-purpose room with a fireplace. Family members all ate, slept, and bathed in this one room.
This is awesome. Keep in mind, no electricity, and this would have been your only heat source, like right here. This here seems like luxury to me, this like wood fire oven, like right in the middle. I've seen other examples of one-room cabins, and this one's a lot bigger than other examples we've seen. That was amazing seeing what life would have been like for a typical ranching family. Keep in mind that entire families lived in these one-room cabins, so no privacy. The little thing in there, the little presentation was talking about how, you know, mom and dad might share like something the equivalent of a double-sized bed while the kids laid on the floor, maybe with a mat, sometimes up in the rafters. So just imagine that. Yeah, no privacy at all. And just think too, I mean, what would you really do for entertainment? I mean, you're in there, like in the cold season or whatever, just all crammed in there. You didn't have TV, Netflix, or the things we know today. Just imagine if somehow you were transported back. You were just ripped out of where you're sitting now on your couch watching this, transplanted into that situation. How long would it take you to adjust your expectations? So this is another house. This one's built in 1875, and another territorial governor lived in it. So we can go see like a nice little Victorian home. It's always so cool to come into a house like this because this is kind of getting closer to the time that we know in modern times. I mean, even though this does look antique and stuff, I think I'd be comfortable living in a place like this, wouldn't you? I'm pretty sure, but I think I'd be quite comfortable in these quarters, you know. Much better than sleeping in a tent on the ground. So this house is a really good example, I think, of how the other half lived, so to speak. Compare this to the one-room cabin. This was quite lush. I think I would even be comfortable living here back in the day. This would be my first choice, obviously, probably most of our first choices, but absolutely beautiful example, I think, of what it would have been like to be on the upper echelon of Victorian society, probably out here at the time. So here's another original building. This one was built in 1937. It used to be a machine shop, but now it's a transportation museum. So I think we're gonna see relics of the Old West, pioneering times, transportation. So hopefully we'll see some cool like wagons and stuff is what I'm expecting. Oh wow, look at this. I was not expecting something like this. Oh, wow. So this is an example of a stagecoach that really came into use into the 1880s. You can actually see a picture of a real one. And then let's back out. That looks pretty comfortable, actually. And you have many little buggies and wagons, all from like the 1800s. This one's an 1880. This one over here is 1875. That is so cool. It looks like you even have a sled up there on the top in the background there. And it kind of morphs into the gasoline age, but you have these other antiques, a Model T pickup truck from 1917. And this is, yeah, so the horseless carriage section here. This is a Star 4 touring car from Durant Motors. 1927. And there's a really cool example of a covered wagon of that time. This is not an original. This was constructed in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial of the country. But still, that's really cool to see something like that in person. You can see a lot of stuff about the history of firefighters in these old towns because they were such an essential need. Everything was made of wood, and believe me, as we've seen in this exhibit, towns burned down all the time. In fact, I could think of very few like ghost towns we visit today that just didn't have major fires. I mean, Tombstone had it, I think Bisbee, Prescott, you know, all of them, part of their history seemed to be major fires that just took out most of the towns. And it must have been really scary to be a firefighter back then because, I mean, everything was working against you. So we know that Charlotte Hall was like an OG pioneer coming out here back in the late 1800s, and the way people moved back then. Keep in mind today you got like United Van Lines and you just hire a moving company, but back then you would have to travel hundreds of miles hauling all your stuff in a wagon. The workhorses of the time pulled by horses and mules. So, but there's some interesting things to consider when you start to think about the logistics of how that would work. Amy pointed out this little exhibit, and it's pretty fascinating when you think about it. What this really is about is, you know, pretend that you were about to make this journey, and this thing talks about on November 3rd, 1881, an 11-year-old Charlotte Hall and her family began their journey west, and they had to have a wagon like this. So this really challenges you to think, what could you really fit in there, and what would you leave behind is really the thing to think about. So really, really interesting. Yeah, it's really got me thinking about it. You know, what would you choose if you had to make a journey like that that would take several months to cross uncharted territory out into the frontier? You would obviously need things to survive the trip, several months, but once you got to the place you were going to and you wanted to set down your roots, start building a residence, whatever, you know, what would you need for that? So, you know, tools versus a bathtub. Would you want to ship that bathtub, or was that going to take up too much room? What's more important? These are the things that you'd really have to weigh out. I mean, see, the bathtub, I would say nah, but clearly an ice cream freezer, that's a must-have. Gotta have my Ben & Jerry's. I can't survive without it. Okay, so that about does it for our first exploration of the Charlotte Hall Museum. I mean, you saw it for yourself. If you're into the history of the Old West, the Victorian era, you want to see relics of that time, got to give kudos to Charlotte Hall. So thankful for pioneers like that that realize the importance of preserving history. Only regret I have today is I couldn't see the beautiful roses bloom, but it's always a reason to come back.